Should I open a retail space for my photography studio business? I was having lunch with my daughter 2 days ago, and she's started working professionally as a graphic designer, and she's got excellent skills, excellent work habits, and excellent opportunities. But she's young, and there are moments where she comes across as wanting more. She gets frustrated. People who start out in their own business typically go through these phases. They start working, they realize for whatever reason they don't want to work for somebody else. That's a pretty normal behavior. What happened to me when I was 24 years old, and I explained this to her, I told her my story, she's never heard it before. Well, I'm going to go before I was 24 years old. When I was 20 years old, I started working at a professional mining industrial photography studio in their lab. I ran their lab for almost 2 years. Some of the best jobs I ever had. I got paid peanuts. Peanuts! Virtually nothing. But that's okay. The experience was invaluable. I was extremely shy and didn't have many social skills. So I kind of knew that at some level. So I applied for other jobs. I knew at about a year into that job that there had to be something better, which is a really good philosophy to take on. And I keep telling her that. Always ask yourself, what is the next best thing? So at that time, when I was around 21 years old, I started putting out resumes everywhere. I had a few opportunities, as in job interviews, which would not have occurred to me because I was in many ways unqualified. I didn't have a formal education. And a lot of these places were hiring people with a university or college degree in photography. However, I did get a job eventually at about almost 2 years in to this job as a lab technician. And I got a job doing school photography. And that was one of the worst experiences in my life. But I mean that in a good way. I was so scared, like really scared. The first year was awful. It wasn't even a year, it was a season. Schools come in seasons, typically in the fall, peters out in the wintertime. Lots of travel involved. Hundreds and hundreds of kids every day. Could you imagine that? You're in a school gym and 28 4-year-old kids in a junior kindergarten class come rolling in for their group and individuals. And I'm standing there looking at them and I'm dying. I laugh about it now. But back then, I was really going through a hard time. I had major panic attacks that first year. I thought I was going to have a nervous breakdown. By the second year of doing that job, I started to have some control, some confidence. Many years later, I looked back and I thought to myself, good thing I persisted. And I didn't do any over dependence on medication and or drugs in order to get me through those hard times. I persisted over and over and over again. After that 2-year stint, I did work a little bit part-time, but I worked 8 months running a large franchise national photography business, and I got laid off because I was not very good at it. But I mostly didn't have good training. I think I was trainable. The company just wasn't that well run. But anyways, what happened next was where it all changed for me. I went on unemployment insurance. And when you're on unemployment insurance and they send you a reference for a job that shows up on their listings, you have to contact those people and go for a job interview. That's the rules. I didn't know it at the time, but I had such a reference come through. They called me and said, we have a place that does pipe photography. Now what they are is they run cables with a camera in the front looking for blockages in sewers. And they call it photography. And I'm like, that's not what I do. So I didn't go. They found out 2 weeks later, they contacted me and said, you didn't go. You're supposed to go. And we're going to cut you off from your unemployment insurance. And at that time, I was 24, almost 25 years old. And I was kind of bummed out at first, but then I was like, you know what? I'm going to start my studio. And I did. I had a 3-bedroom apartment on a very busy street, which at one time used to be a bookkeeping firm. So the decor was nice. They had a room where I set up as a studio. I had a roommate, and he was kind of annoyed at me for doing all that, but he kind of put up with it. And it was really good for what it was. It was my start into my own business. But I was only there for 10 months because what happened next was really where things started to happen for me. I was given an opportunity by a local photographer. Him and his wife had a beautiful home at a home studio, custom designed as a studio, and they wanted to move out into the country, and they had their house listed on the market, and the market was down. And he came to me, he said, "Do you want to rent my place?" And he gave me an offer, and I said, "Well, I can't really afford that." He said, "Okay." A week later, he came back and he made me an offer I couldn't refuse. Now, that's where it started for me, and that's where my business, Westmount Photography, started, because that was the actual business that I took over at the age of 25. It was quite the opportunity, and I believe to this day that that opportunity would not have occurred to me had I not started my first studio, which I called Mr. Photo, by the way. I'm embarrassed. All right, back to my original question. Should I start a retail studio? All right, I'm going to give you a couple tips, and I think this applies to anybody who wants to start any kind of a business. It doesn't matter what it is. If you're an agency or a plumber or a candlestick maker or a butcher, it doesn't matter. So there might come a time in your life where you're just frustrated, and that, like, you have the desire, but it just fuels the desire and lights a fire under your butt. So you got to be full of desire. The first chapter, the first principle in one of the best business books of all time, called Think and Grow Rich, the first principle is desire. So you have to be honest with yourself. Am I doing this because I really want it? Because that's what's going to push you through all the hard times, and you will have hard times. So the next item I want to bring up is you have to be prepared. Be prepared. You got to make sure you're able to deliver the services and products. The biggest mistake that I see people do in starting a business is they have an idea and they fall in love with the idea, and there's no market for it. It's a good idea. It looks good on paper. Everybody would agree it's a good idea, but nobody wants to buy it. If nobody wants to buy what you're offering, you either got to change the way you're offering it or get into a different business. It doesn't matter how good it sounds. So you have to be prepared. You have to have enough skills in order to deliver whatever product and or service, or you have to be able to outsource it, delegate it. And if you're wanting to really grow at a large level, franchise and all that, you have to create systems. This is really important. And a book that's really quite critical on that topic is Michael Gerber's book, The E-Myth. I highly recommend that book. So you got to be realistic. You got to be realistic on all these points. Do you want it? Are you willing to put up with the nonsense, the BS, the hard times, the uncertainty? I personally am well adapted to those struggles, and I took to them very well. I've always asked myself, what's the next best thing? Okay, shit's hitting the fan. What do I need to do next? I live by goals, I live by plans, and having creative ways to come up with solutions. You have to develop these sort of as skill sets in your life when you're in business for yourself. And I think it's really important that you're always learning. You're always constantly studying. And this is something that I've applied in my life. So the other thing that I want to close off with is that you got to give it 3 to 5 years. I grew up, my dad was in business, my grandfather was in business, my uncles, most of whom were in business in a small town. Small businesses, I like small businesses. My photography studio that I'm currently running with my wife is a mom and pop studio. I love that kind of business. And it's small. You might think it's kind of dinky and all, but I wouldn't have it any other way. But regardless, no matter how big you're going or want to stay, you have to give it 3 to 5 years before you really have any consistency, before you're established in the marketplace. And especially during the first 3 years. it's probably a really smart move to have some money put aside in case things get really bad. The worst thing to do is to go into a business, in my opinion, with a large debt load. It's not a great idea to finance it. And you got to be careful with this one too, because if you have a lot of money put aside, and I've seen people do this, they have the business idea, which is a really, really crappy idea, and they start throwing money at it, and it's sort of, the business looks like it's alive, but it's not. It's being propped up by money, and that's all fine and good until the money runs out. And it's especially sad if you're remortgaging your house or you're blowing your life savings in anticipation of this business, which never took off, and it all goes away when the money goes away. So if you're going to start a business, you got to be prepared with these things. And if you're going to start a photography studio, it's especially tricky in today's day and age. I think the default position that you need to take is to really be serious about treating your business as a business. And this is probably the one area where I see most people lacking in application. Systems, creating offers, and getting out there in the marketplace, pushing the marketing, pushing your brand, working at it day after week, after month, after year, and creating systems based on selling and marketing and delivering the product, and to be confident enough to ask for the money, because in photography, there's very few studios around these days in most small, medium, and large cities. They're there, but not like they used to be when I was coming of age. There were many, many more. They've all gone away, and I believe the reason is that a lot of them took things for granted. So you don't want to take things for granted. You have to work these things more than ever. I've been saying this for the last 20 years, especially since digital came about, which really lowered the barrier of entry for anybody to get into photography. And you got a lot of people into photography. Now you got a lot of moms with cameras, or people who are doing like newborn portraits or weddings on the side. They're more side gigs than anything. Many of these people have spouses which have really good incomes. And that's all fine. I have no problem with that. What we're talking about here is if you're going to start a legitimate business, especially if you're going to move into a retail situation. I like the idea of having a home studio, and I like the idea of having a home studio with a mom and pop operation. I think it's tougher nowadays, but it's made much, much easier if you're willing to be very serious about finding solutions based on good business practices and really good marketing strategies. I've said it from day one. I'll say it again right now. Marketing is everything. So I hope I've given you something to think about. And before you open up your photography studio, you have to be really serious about these questions I'm bringing up. You have to be realistic. You have to be prepared. You have to have enough desire and passion. And you have to be realistic. I mean, I really got to emphasize that point. You have to be able to think realistically so that you're not swept away by your possible delusions. Dan Kennedy wrote a good book on this particular topic called How to Make a Million with Your Ideas. It's a really good book, by the way, and I highly recommend it. All right. I hope I've given you something to think about. Thanks for your time.